Hello again. Now, the promise of a non-racial democracy is far from reality. That's according to the Director of Government and Public Policy, Ivor Chipkin. He's penned an interesting piece on how the idea of South Africa is, quote-unquote, blowing in the wind. Chipkin reflects on where we are as a nation, our political sphere, and the influence of state institutions. He's joining us now virtual to further unpack his thoughts. Ivor, good afternoon. Welcome to Today on eNCA. Thank you very much for your time. Very interesting opinion, but it's thought-provoking as well. I think interesting is not the right word to use. It's really got my mind going, particularly around the issues of comparing the struggle for freedom in South Africa with the rest of the world, where most of it there was about self-determination, but in South Africa became different. But you'll touch on that, I'm sure, as you answer. But where are we at today?
So I think thank you for thank you for having me on the show and framing the questions around issues of self-determination and South Africa's particular part, because I think it is very, very different. Where we are today is, I think, this particular idea of South Africa is in trouble. It's certainly, it's both in trouble at the level of ideas. I think there are many ideas that are contesting it. But most importantly, in South Africa, the idea of South Africa wasn't just expressed at the level of talk, at the level of symbols. It was instantiated in our constitution, and it gave rise to a whole constellation of institutions of state and of government. So when I say that it's blowing in the wind, I mean at the level of ideas, but also many of the institutions that were established and created to give expression to that idea are in fundamental trouble. So I think we're in a state of crisis. And what I wanted to argue and what I wanted to do in that piece was to say that the crisis is not just about bad people stealing a lot of money. It's not just about corruption. It's rather that underpinning our current malaise is a crisis of politics, a crisis of ideas, a crisis of a sense of who we are as a South African people, and do we want to even be a South African people? So that's what the piece is trying to do.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a fair question, but could we have seen a different South Africa today if the ANC, as you write in your opinion piece, had not abandoned the term self-determination from its lexicon in the 50s and just went on this term of nationalism, non-racial democracy? And do you think it would be in a different pace, or that's not the point?
Oh, no, it is fundamentally the point. I think we have an extraordinary ability in South Africa to think in the short term, and to underestimate or to underestimate, obscure some of our extraordinary achievements. What I think we understood it was understood in the 80s and 1990s was that the South African experience was of not just interest to South Africans, but in some senses we were global. We were setting a historical trend. We were trying to do something very, very different, and I think it relates to the idea of South Africa. So. And the paper gets into some detail regarding to the notion of self-determination. But self-determination is a concept which animated many of the struggles against colonialism around the world, in Africa and in Asia. It was informed by, strangely enough, an especially European construction of anti-imperialism, designed especially for Slavs and Greeks and Germans struggling for independence from European empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And it was associated with an idea that the nation was an entity which was homogenous in certain fundamental respects. Homogenous around language, homogenous around culture, homogenous around religion, for example, and that the idea of decolonization from that point of view was the emergence of these homogenous nation states. Yeah. Very strangely and unexpectedly,
Yeah, carry on.
Is that model? That model becomes the model of the post-Second World War period. So apartheid in this respect was part of a development which was coming out of the post-war period in Europe and rolling out. The African National Congress and the Communist Party move in a very, very different direction. They say that the idea of a post-independent decolonized South Africa will not be a nation understood in those terms, but rather something extraordinary. It'll be a place which accommodates in the same territory a colonial population with their colonial oppressors in a single territory. And rather than try and create a homogeneous population, rather what we will do is we'll deal with the extraordinary violence of exploitation and racial violence from the apartheid past. We'll deal with it not through self-determination, but rather by building a democracy, by building institutions, redistributive institutions, democratic institutions, by transforming the economy, the idea of a plural society in a single territory. Quite a remarkable idea.
But as you say, therefore, because of that, we cannot believe or say it was a naive story of rainbowism, as you say, because some people have now said there's no rainbow nation, we're disappointed. But it's really about hard work of building a new state, building a plural society. But the institutions that you said, the institutions currently, as you said, blowing in the wind, they're not helping, because you make a point that the people who work in them do not share the normative values that should underpin them. And that could be part of the problem. We are pulling in different directions.
So that's largely the argument, is that we have these ideas, we establish a constitution, then we build all these institutions. And they need to run to realize this vision. And yet the argument is that many of these institutions will start with people that don't believe in that project. And we see it more and more. I mean, July 2021, we call it a revolt. We don't even know what it was. Some sort of massive insurrection happens within South Africa. There are many, including from within the most senior parts of the African National Congress, which reject fundamentally the constitutional dispensation. They reject the rule of law. There's we used the language of repurposing in a report from 2017, which we just studied state capture. We talked about how institutions are being repurposed. In other words, they're being twisted, manipulated away from their formal legislative or constitutional purposes to serve other purposes. So we have fundamentally, at the level not just of our ideas, but in our institutions, materially, a subversion of that idea of South Africa.
So the other point you make, which I found interesting, is the fact that in the name, as you say, of anti-imperialism, the left is coming to endorse third world or nationalism in countries like South Africa that we're talking about, turning a blind eye to all the challenges like patriarchy, elitism, and stuff like that. That presents a problem, because it raises some contradictions.
Well, I mean, I think for me, this is the great surprise, that South Africa is full of a language of radicalism, a language which identifies self-consciously as radical, a language of decolonization, and yet, when I listen to that language, when I read that language, I see nothing radical at all, especially when it denounces South Africa's constitutional settlement, when it denounces the idea of non-racialism in the name of it, somehow non-racialism is some kind of Mickey Mouse, multiracial kumbaya, all holding hands and singing songs together. When I look at that radicalism or those claims to decolonialism, what I see in those things is a very ancient and very disturbing European nationalism. That's the great irony. So in the name of radicalism, what the radicals are offering us is a very disturbing 19th century, early 20th century European nationalism. That is hardly decolonial. It's certainly not radical in my terms. What is radical and extraordinary, and perhaps even undoable, is the project of modern South Africa, and I think that's why we should rally behind it. It's really a potentially historically important project which we're involved in, and we're prepared to give it up. It seems to me so easily.
Yeah, and from what you've just said, you're sort of emphasizing the fact that then you've got this, what you've called in your article, in your opinion piece, an uncanny arc between the left, or uniting the left and the extreme right, in a common span of nationalism that you've just explained that is extraordinarily linked to Europe. But at the stake is the end of South Africa. So where are we headed?
So I think we are in the midst of quite a serious contestation around these ideas. I think the problem is, though, we because we keep using the language of corruption and incompetence to explain what's going on, we're not sufficiently paying attention to the political battles that are happening simultaneously. And as a result, I think we're not adequately diagnosing the problem. I think we have to admit that there are very different understandings or conceptions of what South Africa is and what South Africa should be, and that we need to deal with that rather than endlessly imagining that the problem is a handful of corrupt people and all we need to do is put them in jail, or that we need to rewrite legislation to make corruption more difficult. Those are merely symptoms of what I'm arguing is an underlying crisis of the idea of South Africa. And that, I think, is what we need to start thinking around. We need to start imagining again, what does it mean to be a South African? What does it mean to be in a democracy? Do we want to concede the terrain of democracy to some sort of authoritarian governments? I mean, authoritarianism is very popular at the moment. These are the arguments or the discussions which I think we should be having. We shouldn't only be arguing about who's corrupt and who's not corrupt. Of course, those are important, but they're not. I don't think they're fundamental.
We should be discussing the idea of South Africa. What is it? Thank you very much for your time and your analysis and sharing some more thoughts about your opinions there. That's Dr. Ivor Chipkin, Director of Government and Public Policy. Very, very interesting thoughts indeed. Now,